Good evening and welcome to Congress Hall at Independence National Historical Park. I'm Patrick Sudduth, I'm the acting superintendent. And what a lovely evening to see you all here. It's wonderful to see such a full audience tonight for this World Affairs Council of Philadelphia event. Congress Hall is an appropriate place for tonight's debate, as the program promises to be an interesting discussion on a topic that is so relevant to the historic events that took place here. For 10 very significant years between 1790 and 1800, Philadelphia served as our nation's capital. During this pivotal time in our nation's history, this building served as the temporary home of Congress. You are seated in the chamber for the House of Representatives. The Senate met upstairs. The President lived and worked a block away. They must have been keenly aware that the world was watching and what was at stake. This was the site of intense debate, charting the future of the young nation and setting precedents for the next 2 centuries. During the decade that Philadelphia was our nation's capital, Congress faced numerous challenges and our Constitution was put to its first tests. George Washington, who had served as the president of the Constitutional Convention before he was president of the country, wrote that what they had done in 1787 was little short of a miracle in Philadelphia. Others were not so sure. George Mason, another Virginian, refused to sign the Constitution partly because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Some were fearful that the new, powerful central government might usurp the rights of the states and the people themselves. Only 2 years later, after signing the Constitution, the Congress submitted the first amendments to the states, amendments we now know as the Bill of Rights, ratified while Congress was seated right here. The first Bank of the United States was chartered right here in 1791 to manage the tremendous debt caused by the war, championed, of course, by Alexander Hamilton and opposed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The nation expanded while Congress met here, when Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee became new states. The presidency was also shaped here by our first 2 presidents, George Washington and John Adams. As the nation's first, George Washington set the tone of leadership of a new republic and sought to keep the nation at peace. Not all of our history makes us proud today, but it's important to remember the whole record. Though the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution, the issue was central to the debate over commerce and representation. The 3/5 compromise provided that 3/5, 60% of enslaved people in each state would count toward congressional representation, increasing the number of representatives for southern states. In return, southern states agreed to stop importing slaves from Africa by 1808. As a result, Congress assumed the power to regulate the commercial aspects of slavery. Also, while here in 1793, Congress in fact passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which provided for the return of runaway slaves and made it a crime to help a runaway slave in his or her quest for freedom. And of course, the platform behind me is where John Adams was sworn in as the nation's second president on March 4th, 1797. The peaceful transfer of power between leaders marked a significant milestone for this fledgling government. You can see that the historic events that took place here rival the importance of events that happened in Independence Hall next door, and that individual people, their words, actions, and work here in this building, in this room, have shaped history, and that's why we remember them. Congress Hall is an ideal setting for remembering and understanding our foundations and for envisioning our future. I am sure that tonight's program will be just as enlightening and just as provocative. And now I would like to introduce Tim Gillespie, President for the Mid-Atlantic region of Wilmington Trust and M&T Bank, and Board Director of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Tim?
Thank you, Superintendent, and good evening, everyone. I, along with my colleagues from Wilmington Trust and M&T Bank, join with the Independence National Historical Park in welcoming you to this evening's very timely conversation. The topic, Indispensable America versus America First, America's role in the world under President Trump. M&T Bank, the company I work for, headquartered in Buffalo, New York, traces its roots in Western New York to 1856 and is one of the largest financial institutions in the country with $123 billion of assets. I represent the Wilmington Trust subsidiary of the company, which is one of the largest personal trust and investment companies in the country with $80 billion in assets under management, based out of Wilmington, Delaware. Our firm's 17,000 employees are actively involved in the organizations that are critical to the local communities which we serve, such as the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. In fact, Wilmington Trust has been a proud sponsor and supporter of the nonpartisan educational efforts of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for more than 20 years. We are delighted to do so again this evening and for this season's programs. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce to you my friend Craig Snyder, who is President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, to begin this evening's programs. Craig.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Superintendent Sudduth. The World Affairs Council prizes its partnerships, both with wonderful corporate citizens like Wilmington Trust and our ongoing, very special relationship with Independence National Historical Park. It's a privilege always to be in this space. I also want to thank all of you for joining us. This is the opening of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's 69th program season. And this program in particular is the latest installment in the Stan and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation Great Debates series. As always, our thanks for the generosity of Stan and Arlene, who are with us this evening, and for our corporate supporters, Amatec, UGI, and SEI, who rose to meet Stan's challenge to create this series. Obviously, we wanted the subject matter for tonight to be appropriate, both for the location that we're using and also for today's date, September 11th. Those of us who remember it, for those of us who remember it, it is quite unbelievable that September 11th, 2001 is now long enough ago that in the next presidential election there will be millions of Americans voting who can't remember it. It seems like yesterday, however, for those of us who can remember it, and as many have used the term, it was perhaps the worst day in modern memory. So it's quite fitting that tonight we discuss the proper role of the United States in a complex and dangerous world, with so many realities about the world of the 21st century having been seared into the consciousness of many Americans on that September 11th, especially the reality that the once seemingly mighty moat around the United States, provided by oceans to the east and west and friendly neighbors to the north and south, no longer permits us in the 21st century to presume that our loved ones are physically safe from the demons of the wider world. Our debaters for this evening are Michael Doran and Evelyn Farkas. Michael is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. He served in the George W. Bush White House as a Senior Director in the National Security Council and also as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Evelyn Farkas is a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a National Security Analyst for MSNBC. She served under President Obama also as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, in her case for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and before that as a Senior Advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Our format for tonight's debate is as follows. The program will begin with about 5 minutes of opening remarks by each of our guests. A coin toss has determined that Evelyn will go first. Following the opening remarks, I'm going to pose 4 rounds of questions to the panelists. Each panelist will have, give or take, 2 minutes to answer each of the questions, and then each panelist will have 5 minutes during which they can ask a question of the other, respond to the other, and maybe we'll get in a round of follow-up as well. Finally, there will be 2 minutes given to each panelist to present their closing remarks. Everybody got that? We're gonna quiz you on it. Okay. So with that, our first opening statement. Evelyn, feel free to be here or stay seated as you choose.
Okay,
Thank you.
well, I can come up.
Great. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, my worthy opponent. Thank you, all of you, for coming out on this beautiful fall evening. I'm going to start, it might be less than 5 minutes because I just want to make 4 points, and so if they're a minute apiece, that might come at 4 minutes. The first point is, the question that you pose in the title is, is America indispensable still, or should America be indispensable? And my perspective on this is very clear. I believe that America is indispensable when it comes to maintaining the current world order. And this world order is the one that has maintained security and prosperity for the United States since the Cold War, and that's what's at stake here. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that America is indispensable to maintaining the current world order. If, however, you think the current world order no longer serves U.S. interests, or you never supported it to begin with, like some nations and leaders in the world, then you would be maybe open to the argument that the United States is not indispensable, and in fact you, fill in the blank, China, Russia, et cetera, you would like to take the role of the United States. So I believe that without America leading the way, maintaining and defending the current system that we have, the current international system, the institutions, the rule of law that undergirds our current system, we face the danger of another state coming in, filling the vacuum, and essentially altering the international order. And there's a lot of risk in that for the United States, clearly. The second point I want to make, well, it really is that this international order is under attack. And again, we can go into that in more detail, but certainly we see out there Russia is no longer behaving as a status quo power to the extent that it was now comfortable enough to attack US elections, to say nothing of elections in Eastern and Western Europe, which they had already been doing to some extent for a while. But in addition to that, of course, in 2014, for the first time since the Second World War, Russia attempted to alter international borders using force in their attempted illegal annexation of Crimea. And I say attempted illegal because it's not recognized by the international community, by international law, by the United Nations, et cetera. And Russia's also undertaken a lot of other actions that are essentially counter status quo. They are counter to international law, they are counter to international norms, and I can make a list of them. I call them the list of the lamentables. There's about 17 of them, or 12 of them, sorry, I don't want to overinflate, but it's bad enough. And the main point is that they're pushing against the status quo. China is still a status quo power, but they do push here and there the building of the islands, the artificial island building campaign that they've started a couple of years ago in the South China Sea and really ramped up more recently in the last couple of years of the Obama administration, and they're continuing today. That is something that's also counter to the status quo, counter to international law, because they're doing it in the parts of the sea and using islands that are in dispute by several nations internationally. So I think it's just important to note again that the world order that we've relied upon, that we believe has ensured for us our security and prosperity, it's under attack. I'm not even going to mention non-state actors. I can talk about that a little bit more as we go into the program and maybe touch upon it in a second when I talk about President Trump. So getting to President Trump, the third point I'd like to make, and this is very important when it comes to President Trump, is that consistently and bafflingly, he seems to underestimate America's power. We have not receded from the lead. We are the leading economic, military, diplomatic power. And in fact, we are stronger, relatively speaking, economically to many other states than we have been in a while, looking at our European allies and others. Of course, there are other countries that are more populous, that have larger, bigger rates of growth. So they pose a threat to us, perhaps in the medium to long run, economically. perhaps also politically and militarily, although that's not a foregone conclusion. And I think we can talk about the relationships with those nations. Now I'm thinking mainly of China and India. So the world is changing, but the United States is still in the forefront. And most importantly, I believe that we have an authoritative voice because the United States, whether we had a government in the White House that was more internationalist, more interventionist, or more isolationist, was still interested in setting an example on the world stage, in being that country on the shining hill, to use the cliche that Ronald Reagan liked. Even if we're not trying to make other countries more democratic, I guess in the kind of worst case analysis or the most extreme way of formulating what we did internationally over the years, we have tried to provide an example for the world. I believe that's in jeopardy, so we can talk about that some more. And I believe it's fitting that we talk about it here in this hall where the Bill of Rights were signed. And then I guess the last point I would make is that, and it's probably a segue into the first round of questions, that there is much about this administration's foreign policy that we do not yet know. So in this discussion, what is probably most interesting about it is that we can go off in many different directions because much of the Trump administration's foreign policy is unsettled. And in fact, there are many areas where thus far these policies remain consistent with the previous administration, with the Obama administration's policies. So for better or worse, we have a mixed bag here, and we'll have a very interesting discussion. And thank you for the more than 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's so exciting to be here in this room. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Evelyn. Thanks to all of you for coming. For me, the starting point of this discussion is actually domestic politics, because I think that all of the major messages that the Trump campaign made during the election about foreign policy were really designed to reinforce their domestic political message. So I think that's where we need to start. The theme of the campaign, you all know, of course, was the forgotten man. When Trump began his campaign, I worked for two other Republican candidates in the election. I tanked one, and then I worked for another one, I tanked that one. And then all my friends said, why don't you go to work for Trump? And I said, no, I'm going to sit it out. They were hoping I would tank him too, but I stood back and just watched. The first one I worked for was Scott Walker, and I wouldn't say I was in the inner circle, maybe one ring out from the campaign, but I had a number of conversations with the campaign manager, and he explained to me that how Trump was going to lose. His negatives were so high, there's no possible way he could win. They'd run the numbers scientifically, and they'd come up with a number of 16%. That was the maximum amount of the Republican electorate that Trump could possibly win. After he hit 16, that was the magic ceiling, and then he was going to drop out. You all know the story. He blew past 16, he blew past 20, he blew past 26. For a while, 32 was, again, the magic number. He blew past that, and so on. And at some point, as he kept blowing past these ceilings, I realized that he was really on to something, that there was something happening in the country writ large. And I think we saw that on the Democratic side as well in the fierce fight that Bernie Sanders put up to Hillary Clinton. Around about the time that Bernie Sanders won the Michigan primary against Hillary Clinton, I realized that there was a kind of full-fledged movement or revolt against the status quo in the country. And for whatever reason, somehow Donald Trump put his finger on that very early. And I think he put his finger on that before the campaign ever began. And he identified nationalism versus globalism as the central issue. And over time, I've come to agree with him. Our elite on both sides, Republican and Democratic, has been presenting our foreign policy with a set of, in the kind of language that Evelyn used, and frankly I would have used, before. I continue to use myself, but I would have used even more before the campaign, about world order, our place in the system, and so on. A lot of disembodied systemic discussions without reference to the national interest of the United States, and in particular the interests of average Americans. And I think that our discourse about foreign policy became very much disconnected from the day-to-day concerns of people. And again, I think you can see that on the left, and I think you can see that on the right. 2 nights ago, or maybe it was last night, I saw it on Twitter 2 nights ago, so I don't know when it actually happened. Steve Bannon was on 60 Minutes. I didn't actually see the program. I just saw a little clip where he's talking to Charlie Rose, and he said, in the next election, it's going to be a populist election. The big question in the next election is, will it be a populist left or a populist right? That's the issue that is going to be decided in the next election. I wholeheartedly agree. That's the way I see it. And I think the challenge for people like us who are foreign policy professionals is to learn how to express the things that we're concerned about when we look at the international arena, the rise of Russia or the Russian aggression, the rise of China, Iran, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on, in terms that actually make sense to the American people. I think that what we're seeing, that's how I understand Donald Trump. I see him as a corrective and almost an inevitable corrective. A big message to the elite, and that means the political elite, it means the foreign policy elite, that they need to start rethinking their positions and speaking in a way and defining our interests in a way that makes sense to average Americans. Something has happened in this country in the last 20 years with the middle class. People no longer feel that their government represents their interests. They no longer feel that the foreign policy is actually looking out after them. And that's where I think the discussion should be. But it's not where the discussion has been. I think there's been a concerted attempt on the part of the media, the foreign policy elite that I'm part of, I would say a lot of my colleagues, and the Democratic establishment, but a chunk of the Republican establishment as well, to completely delegitimate Donald Trump. They latch into every faux pas he makes, into every statement that he makes that can be misconstrued or construed in a way that is going to be particularly damaging to him, and they hammer away on it and hammer away on it and hammer away on it. I see I have a red card. I thought I was going to pick up some extra minutes from Evelyn, but she didn't.
I see minutes.
I think that this is that this approach is misguided on many levels. If Donald Trump leaves the scene tomorrow, many of my colleagues in Washington, and I am ending on this sentence, many of my colleagues in Washington seem to believe that if Donald Trump leaves the scene, we go back to where we were in 2012. And to me, that is patently wrong. It's patently obvious that we're in a whole new stage now, the post-Cold War world. And we're gonna be having these discussions about how to bring our understanding of foreign policy into alignment with the concerns of the American people, whether Donald Trump is here or not. I think he has really changed our politics and our foreign policy in that way, and that's what we should be discussing. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question directed to Evelyn, and then Michael, obviously you'll come in with a chance to respond. So, as you said, there's a lot we still don't know about what the Trump foreign policy is going to emerge to be. But there was this op-ed by General McMaster and Gary Cohn that is sort of maybe sort of the most clear articulation so far from a high level of what America First is supposed to mean in sort of more concrete terms. We'll read you one quote that a lot of people have talked about. The world is not a global community, but an arena where nations engage and compete for advantage. Rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we, meaning the Trump administration, embrace it. In your view, is that statement, the world is not a community, it's a competitive place with nations seeking advantage, and the United States needs to embrace that. Is that articulation wrong as a description? Is it wrong as a policy? If so, why?
I think it's simplistic. It's simplistic to say that we're in some kind of competition and we don't have any friends, we don't have partners or allies, because actually what has made the United States strong, what has helped us militarily, economically, politically, has been our allies and partners. They have come with us in a coalition. It's given us legitimacy, a strength of purpose, obviously more firepower, more economic means when we've gone to war. I can think, every time from, let's forget about World War II, but, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, time and again, our allies and partners have gone with us to these conflicts and waged war with us. That's on the defense side. Of course, when it comes to working together to promote trade, that is something that we can talk about, because certainly, I guess a little bit in response to what Michael said, I do agree that the proponents of free trade, they overlooked the issue of the winners and losers, and somehow we weren't talking and we weren't considering, those of us who were free trade proponents, and I'm one of them, weren't considering the impact on Americans and the fact that we weren't mitigating it properly and we weren't communicating overall basically the mitigation issue. So I think, and I think that means that we need to be smarter now going forward when it comes to trade. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have free trade. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue trade agreements. But I think, getting back to your overall question, we find strength in our alliances, in our partnerships. Countries like Russia and China, they don't have allies, they don't have partners. They have to basically use raw interests, which is what that quote's about, to try to maneuver other countries to work with them to do what it is that they would like to have done. And that doesn't always work. In Russia's near abroad, so the countries that are contiguous to Russia in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, they use pressure, they use negative means to try to get those countries to do what they want, and it doesn't always work. Look at the example of Ukraine. They tried so hard using pressure, bribery, and other means, although that's maybe could be seen as a positive pressure, but they used it negatively. And ultimately, Ukraine is further away from Russia than it has been ever in history. So, they managed through their own policies to alienate what might have been a natural ally. That's just one example. But I think the United States, we gain strength through our values. And if I could add one more thing sort of to what I said before, and it's pertinent to your question, we are in a struggle now. We're not in a post-Cold War world, really. And I don't even know if we ever were in a Cold War world that could be divided off from the rest of history. We're in a struggle right now. The United States is in a struggle to defend our democracy against authoritarians who would like our democracy to be weak, if not dismantled. And now, again, I have mainly Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin folks in mind.
Michael. I took, most of my references are, not all of them, but most of them are with the Middle East, because I'm an expert on the Middle East. So I followed very closely what Donald Trump said during the election. And I thought it was pretty savvy politically, because he said that he was going to deliver more with less to the American people, more than his immediate predecessors, Obama and Bush, with less. So he's going to win a lot more without without a massive invasion of another country like George W. Bush. He said, I'm against these kind of adventures that George W. Bush, these quixotic adventures, as he would see it, that George W. Bush engaged in. On the other hand, he and his, and his base, and I would say, I would put myself in that category as well. I saw Barack Obama as weak. I saw him as moving away from allies, abandoning allies, reaching out to enemies, in particular Iran and Russia. Obama presided over the rise of an Iranian-Russian alliance in the Middle East. And what Trump was saying is, I'm going to be ruthless and I'm going to be focused. And I'm going to be much more attentive to the allies, and I'm going to be worse to the enemies than Obama, but I'm also going to be very focused, so I'm not going to get involved in any of these huge adventures like George W. Bush. Now, I think it was a great election message in terms of understanding where the electorate is at. I think it's problematic, especially in the Middle East, because a lot of the problems in the Middle East don't lend themselves to these to a simple kind of solution like this. We can maybe get into details about that later. But I don't think abandoning allies is really what he's all about. It's talking about a recalibration. I mean, the obvious one is the relationship with the European allies. And when I was in the defense, I got the red card again already. I'm not speaking fast enough. Either that or you're biased. Are you biased? I should do like Trump and Hillary. This isn't fair. I'm watching the time. I get 2 more minutes.
I don't think Hillary ever said that.
The red card is spot on.
Someone said it.
I think Trump
All
did.
right. To sum up, where was I anyway? That red card really totally distracted me from my. The European Alliance. Look,
right.
when I was
Right.
in, thank you very much. Somebody's listening. When I was in the Defense Department, and I'm sure Evelyn heard this as well when she was in the Defense Department, I heard Secretary of Defense Gates Secretary Gates was wonderful in terms of tone. If there's a guy who understands how to say, relatively abrasive things, but in a reassuring tone, it's Robert Gates. And he told senior European officials when I was in the Defense Department that you guys are not meeting your 2% obligation to NATO. It's been going on way too long. The American people are starting to notice. If you don't do it, believe me, you're not going to get asked politely like this, right? And lo and behold, he was a very good predictor of what was going to happen. But I don't think anyone can stand up and defend the Europeans on this. It's absolutely indefensible. And that's what I hear Trump saying, that our alliances need to be calibrated to fight the enemies that we have today, and our allies need to be shouldering their fair share of the load.
Thank you.
Can I respond
Please.
to that? I mean, I agree absolutely. First of all, I agree with your praise of Secretary Gates. He's a fantastic leader and Secretary of Defense, and he was right to give that strong message to the Europeans. And the Europeans needed the pressure. I do agree that they needed the pressure that our president is putting on them, but they didn't need it the way they got it in the context that they got it, because they got it from President Trump in a very public, very kind of belligerent fashion, right when they were facing Russia challenging the French elections, of course the upcoming German elections, the Baltic states, and in the Balkans they had just had a coup attempt engineered by the Russians in Montenegro, which was on the verge of becoming a member, but it didn't look like our administration was necessarily going to be in favor of that. So the context and the way that the president went about talking about the alliance and how they needed to contribute more, and then he did it in an erroneous fashion because he made it sound as if somehow there was a bill that the allies, that we submitted to the allies and that they owed us money. He misunderstood the fact that the common budget is dependent on the economic ranking, the GDP basically of each country, and that the 2% was what you spend under Article 3, so in your own defense. It's a political agreement, not something that's written in the Washington, in the Charter. So the problem was he got facts wrong, the way he went about it, and in the context then when we're dealing with Russia challenging our allies, challenging us as well, he didn't go about it the right way. And again, I can get into more in the context because, of course, not only is he telling the allies in this rough way, using the wrong facts that they need to do more, he's also praising Vladimir Putin and disparaging some of our allies and not treating them quite as favorably as he was treating other leaders. And I won't go off into human rights issues right now. But I think all of that caused the consternation, certainly on the side of those of us who didn't vote for him.
Michael, let me come back to you.
I wanted to answer. A little bit?
Little bit. Okay.
I only need about 10 minutes. So just a couple of quick retorts to that. Look, I don't want to be in the position of having to defend the tone or content of every tweet that Donald Trump makes. But if there's an issue that he hammers away at, perhaps in a tone or in a way that I wouldn't prefer, it's almost a certainty that the issue is a real issue. And I don't know, look, we still don't have a commitment from the Germans to come to pony up their 2%. So I don't know what the right way to ask them is. And if he got the details wrong, if he isn't fully versed in the difference between Article 3 and Article 5, then who was President Obama when he started? It doesn't really matter, because if Chancellor Merkel was to come to Trump and say, you're right, you're right, we have not been meeting our commitments, and here's what we're going to do, right? And it wasn't exactly along the lines of what he was talking about, it wouldn't have made any difference. I mean, the message he was sending them is that we're sick of being taken for suckers. And now what they're telling us is that by 2024, is it, or 2022, 2024, I think, they're going to meet their 2% obligation, right? So that's just long enough in the distance that nobody who's around right now asking for the bill to be paid is going to be around to see if it ever gets paid, which is what they always do.
So we are leaving out the bigger issue, which is Article 5, not the telling the Europeans they need to pay more, but the Article 5 issue was more serious, because during the campaign he made it sound as if coming to the assistance of our allies was not automatic, and so therefore throwing into question the foundation of the alliance. And that continued because he sort of stubbornly refused to assertively, clearly state that the United States continued to be behind Article 5, which I know might sound like a tempest in a teapot, but it's not to our allies.
No, it's a tempest in a teapot. I mean, one of the first things they did was send Mike Pence and the Secretary of Defense to Mattis to Europe just to say Article 5, because this is I thought this Article 5 controversy was completely made up by Trump's domestic enemies. He's selling the alliance down the river. He's selling the alliance down the river. So Mattis and I've already forgotten who's and Mattis and Pence went over and they said Article 5, Article 5, Article 5, and then Trump's critics said not good enough, because it didn't come from Trump. And then Trump gave a speech, and there was a debate in the White House about whether to say Article 5 or not. And they briefed the press that he was going to say it, and then he didn't say it. They say, aha, you see, he's really going to sell the allies down the river. Finally, in Poland, he said Article 5, and then what did they say? Oh, it's a racist speech. It's totally racist, and then we forgot the whole Article 5 issue. So I think it's all tempest in a teapot.
Okay, I want to move to, you said we would get into human rights and that sort of aspect of U.S. foreign policy. I want to go in that direction. So right outside these doors, in front of Independence Hall, July 4th, 1917, 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson, president, gave a really important speech right before the beginning of World War I. He said, quote, "The most serious question for sober-minded men to address themselves to in the United States is this: what are we going to do with the influence and power of this great nation? Are we going to play the old role of using that power for our aggrandizement and material benefit alone?" It seemed like, and obviously the full articulation of Wilsonianism, right, was the beginnings of the idea that the United States should not be primarily about narrowly defined economic interests, that our role in the world was about the promotion of values through law, through international law. Trump's approach and Trump's statements in the campaign and as president have marked a significant departure from what you could say Wilson sort of started outside these doors. So I want to start with you, Michael, to say, do you think that the pursuit, that America First means sort of narrow economic interests are really at the core of what we're about in the world? Or do you believe in a broader conception in which the United States is trying to advance its values and the idea of democracy through international law?
I think that it's not yet clear what America First means in the human rights realm. It clearly means, as I suggested before, something much less aggressive, much less muscular than what human rights and democracy promotion was under George W. Bush. But I don't see this as a change, a big change from Obama to Trump. I see it as a change of tone under Trump. Trump is nothing if not a change of tone. But President Obama backed away from democracy and human rights. Now, Obama, who is the thing about Obama, in my view, I happen to, you may not know this about me, but I happen to be the world's greatest analyst of Obama, because I know every thought that goes through his mind. And the reason that is that I spent about 20 years of my life in the Ivy League. And so when I talk to my conservative friends and they say, you know, Barack Obama is a closet Muslim, or he's a Kenyan communist, or he wants to destroy America and all this, I say, no. These are all ridiculous conspiracy theories. You don't need that to understand Obama. You just need to spend time in the Ivy League. Because what makes Obama unique and special, and why he's such an odd duck, is that he has the worldview of a Harvard professor, but he's an extremely talented retail politician. And those two things, you know, there's usually a reason why professors are professors and not politicians. So Obama sees the world exactly like a Harvard professor, but he has the skills of a retail politician. And he knows how to, do I have a red card already? He knows how to talk. He knows how to talk the talk of the educated elite and make them feel like he's totally, like he totally represents their values, right? Under Obama, 10 million Syrians were driven from their homes in ethnic cleansing. 10 million, half the population of Syria. 500,000 Syrians were murdered, right? And Obama's supporters just got the Holocaust Museum to put out a report saying that there was nothing that could possibly be done about this, right? It's amazing. It's amazing. And he's got defenders out there in the internet now saying, yes, this is absolutely true, right? This Syria policy is an incredible blight on our record, right? And Trump's attack on Assad, after Assad used chemical weapons, did more for human rights in Syria than Obama did in 8 years. Evelyn.
Well, I want to say, I told Michael he'd be surprised that we would agree on certain things. And I agree absolutely that our Syria policy was a tragedy of the highest proportion. As somebody who worked in Bosnia in 1996, right after the war, studied it, wrote my dissertation in part on it. I believe actually in military intervention, in limited intervention to save lives if we can, and I believe there were circumstances all along the way in Syria where we could have done so, and certainly that civil war continues unabated, unresolved, and so I don't think I need to add anything to that. The only thing I would say, and I also agree on the tone issue. So when I said in my opening remarks that there was some continuity in the policies, there is a lot of continuity. Sadly, Syria is one of those areas where there's a continuity. The current president, well, he may have allowed the military to do more, he may have put more military in, and I applaud that, and I did applaud also the strike in response to Syria's use, again, on a large scale of chemical weapons, although I think that was also, it was helpful to the human rights agenda, but also helpful to the non-proliferation agenda, because we need to show other nations that we will not let use of weapons of mass destruction stand. But so I think that President Trump has not really done much to change the course of what's happening in Syria. It looks like we will have the defeat of ISIS, and so there will be a chance for some more stability in Iraq, but you can't really separate Syria and Iraq. It's all one big conflict, and until we get a negotiated agreement, we have no hope for the region. And our president doesn't seem to have a plan to bring the various folks to the table. The Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians are winning, and they will continue fighting until they can get as much as they can get. And that's not a winning proposition for us, for Turkey, for our allies in the moderate opposition. So I didn't mean to speak so long on Syria that I got a red card. But I can say more about human rights later. But I would just say that, look, the wisest presidents were pragmatic, and I think some of our presidents went too far on the spectrum when it comes to advocacy for human rights, that sometimes it bumped into U.S. vital. Sometimes we ended up fighting or putting energy into areas where it wasn't a vital interest. Certainly Wilson himself was very controversial in his foreign policy in Europe and elsewhere. And I think the best presidents take realism and liberalism and mix it and come up with something that is in U.S. interests, where we're pursuing U.S. interests, but through values that also reflect who we are and therefore strengthen us and therefore bring others to the table, if you will, getting back to the earlier point about having partners and allies.
Okay, so I'm going to stay with you, and I want to kind of stay with this theme of continuity versus discontinuity between the administrations, because there's a lot of discussion about Trumpism and America First being a radical break, and I guess what I'm hearing when it comes to the question of human rights, when it comes to the question of the promotion of democracy, of intervention versus non-intervention. I want to sort of pose a thesis and have you respond to it, which is that Trump hasn't been throwing out some sort of hallowed consensus on those issues of intervention, non-intervention, human rights versus material interest. That he hasn't been sort of throwing out a consensus.
Right, has not.
Has not.
Yeah.
That what he has been doing, I'm posing to you, is just sort of honestly naming the reality that the United States has sort of over-promised the world ever since Wilson, that we would make the world safe for democracy, that we would bring human rights, and we've never, certainly since World War II, that we've never really matched our might, if you will, with the level of our commitments. So we had a speaker very recently that talked about a war game in the Baltics and said if Putin wanted to take the Baltics today, he could do it in 60 hours, maybe less.
Right, but we'd be there the next day. Well, maybe not the next day, but
so my question to you is what you've heard from Trump, in your view, at this point, is it sort of a radical break, or is it a political reframing, as I hear Michael maybe perhaps saying, a political reframing of what used to be called realism?
As Trump articulates what he wants to do, it's alarming because it's dark. Again, this America is somehow this dark criminal place in economic decline. The picture he paints doesn't even make me hopeful about what we can do for ourselves, much less the world. I think just like humans need aspiration, we need hope, we need to set goals for ourselves. What is it that you do? January 1st, you set your resolutions. I mean, you need to have goals, you need to have aspirations in order to move forward and to strive for something better. And we all know in life you don't immediately attain the objective, and maybe you fall somewhat short, but the process of trying to reach that goal in and of itself can be laudatory, and wherever you get to along the way, obviously, should be better than where you started. It's not a given, it's not a guarantee, but I think as a rule, we should set forth goals for ourselves and for the international community that are laudatory. We will always fall short. There will always be the Rwandas, the Syrias, the mistakes that we make. And, Bosnia, maybe we took 3 years to get there, but we got there, and we can at least feel better that we got there, and there's been stability there, even though there are many problems today still in Bosnia. So I would argue that you need to have those goals in order to push yourself forward, in order to hold yourself accountable or the government accountable. I forgot the second part of your question because I did have but I'll leave it at that.
So radical break or just political reframing?
I think it's definitely a political reframing, and I think it's a break. I don't think it's going to be as radical as his critics are saying. I think where we're going to end up with Trump in the end is sort of the Nixon administration. Remember, Kissinger and Nixon were hated on the right, on the neoconservative right for détente for China, but also détente with Russia, and not having a values-based foreign policy. And Nixon was also responding to the Vietnam War and the feeling in the country that we had militarily overreached. He pulled back, and the Nixon doctrine the idea was the United States does less direct application of military force, and in place it builds up allies. And I think that's basically the concept that Trump has in his mind. But there are certain things we're not going to get from Donald Trump. I keep wanting Donald Trump to be Ronald Reagan. I keep wanting him to give stirring speeches that speak to me on a moral level, you know.
That are positive?
I don't think. No, I'm getting to that. I don't think he's dark and negative at all. That's not what I hear. I think he's just a certain kind of guy, and he has a certain view of himself, and he sees himself as a pragmatic fixer. And he's not going to be the guy. He's not going to be the guy who appeals to your, that appeals to you on a moral level. He's not going to be setting the moral tone, right? We kind of want that from presidents, and we expect it, but that's not the job that he's going to be doing. But I think it's a positive message. I think. Look, if we live in Philadelphia. We're speaking in Pennsylvania, and you all know James Carville said famously of Pennsylvania that it's got Philadelphia in the east, and Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in the middle, right? So if you spend some time in Alabama, right, people are not doing well there. They're not doing well. There's a sense that a lot of people have in this country. We don't share it in Washington, D.C., but there's a lot of people in this country that foreigners are coming in and taking their jobs. We've got the influx of immigrants. We've got a huge rise in drug addiction. We've got a media that is no longer locally based and that is describing that's reporting on what's happening from the two coasts. And there's a sense, I think, that a lot of people have, and it's not just in the United States, it's in the same thing in Britain, the same thing in France, you can see it everywhere, that the people no longer have local control over their own fate. And what I hear Trump saying is we can regain that. We can regain it. Now, it's an open question in my mind as to whether we can regain it in the modern world. But Trump has identified it as a problem and saying that's the problem that he's trying to fix. I find that to be a very positive message. I think whether Trump does it correctly or not, that is the problem we should all be focused on. And believe me, I agree. Like I said, I agree with Steve Bannon. In the next election, we're going to be focused on that, on the left and on the right.
Okay, want to be mindful of time, and we want to get to questions for the audience. So I'm going to ask you each to give closing remarks. And we're going to go in the opposite order that we went before. So you're starting.
All right. Well, in a way, I think I just did give my closing remarks. I think that what we're living through right now is a recalibration, and it's a very needed recalibration. I wish President Trump were more effective at explaining that recalibration and what he's trying to do. I think that too often he speaks in a way that offers up, he hands clubs to his enemies to beat him with. I find him a rather Shakespearean character in that regard. I think he had this very, very incisive understanding of the problems that we face today, and he came up with some